From the very beginning, this situation never moved like a real lawsuit. Anyone who's watched enough legal drama knows when something is about accountability and when it's about optics. What stands out immediately is that there was never a clear plan to actually take this case all the way through. What we're looking at instead is a sequence of moves that feel rushed, strategic, and carefully timed to create a headline, not a courtroom showdown. Everything starts with the filing to the CRD on December 20, 2024. That date matters more than people realize. Filing a discrimination complaint with the CRD isn't a fast track to suing someone. It's usually the slow lane. First, the agency has to decide if the case even qualifies for investigation. That screening alone can take weeks. If it passes, the investigation itself can stretch close to a year, sometimes longer, depending on complexity. That process includes reviewing evidence from both sides, evaluating legal standards, and in some cases, attempting mediation before anything else happens. None of that is quick, and none of it lines up with urgency. That's where the math stops mathing, because on the same exact day the complaint was filed, it was also closed. No investigation, no evaluation period, no mediation, just filed, processed, and done. That alone tells you the filing wasn't about seeing what the CRD would find. It was about getting a document, a receipt, something official looking that could be referenced immediately. The timing around media involvement makes this even louder. Metadata tied to a major article connected to this case shows work on that piece going back months earlier, well before December. That means the narrative was already being shaped long before the complaint ever existed. The CRD filing didn't kick off the story, it was slotted into it at the last possible moment to make everything look more legitimate. December 20 wasn't just busy, it was surgical. Legal notices were sent out that same day to multiple parties, not through one method, but through everything at once, email and FedEx, making sure no one could claim they didn't get the message. At the same time, the article was being finalized and pushed out. Requests for comment were sent so close to publication that there was effectively no time to respond. Not because response wasn't wanted, but because silence looks better when you're trying to control the narrative. What this starts to look like is pressure, not prosecution. The goal doesn't appear to have been a trial or a judgment. It looks more like an attempt to overwhelm the other side with paperwork, headlines, and public perception all at once. Big moves, big language, serious accusations without the follow-through that normally comes with them. And when you zoom out, that pattern holds. The CRD process, by design, would have slowed everything down. It would have delayed any lawsuit for months. For someone trying to resolve something, quietly or legally, that's fine. For someone trying to drop a story at a specific moment, it's a problem, which explains why the process was never really used. It was bypassed the second it served its purpose. At this stage, nothing here looks like the foundation of a serious legal battle. It looks like window dressing, enough formality to sound real, but not enough substance to survive scrutiny. And that context becomes crucial once we move from paperwork to testimony, because what happens next doesn't clarify the claims, it complicates them. When things shift from filings and timelines to sworn testimony, that's usually where clarity shows up. People might disagree, but facts tend to sharpen. That's not what happens here. Instead, the deposition turns into a loop of non-answers, objections, and statements that never quite land anywhere. And the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to identify what the actual allegation is supposed to be. A straightforward question is asked multiple times. What specifically was done that constituted sexual harassment? Not hypotheticals, not summaries. One clear example. Each time the question comes up, it's met with resistance, either an objection or a response that redirects back to the length of the written complaint instead of the behavior itself. That matters because depositions aren't about vibes or impressions. They're about concrete actions, dates, Words, events, something you can point to and say, that right there. Eventually, after several rounds of circling, an answer does surface. The first incident recalled is a conversation about circumcision, not framed initially as a joke or an advance, but as part of a broader discussion about parenting decisions while pregnancy was already the topic. According to the testimony, the conversation involved medical choices people make for their children, particularly boys, and during that exchange, a personal detail was shared, that he was circumcised. That moment is then presented as the foundation of feeling sexually harassed, but when the context is unpacked, the claim starts to wobble. The conversation didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't isolated from the topic being discussed. It happened in a private residence during a meeting where family and future children were already part of the discussion. Even within the testimony, it's acknowledged that the comment was initially written off as awkward rather than malicious, something perceived as a conversation going too far rather than a targeted act. What makes this section especially difficult to reconcile is how the reaction is described afterward. There's no immediate objection, no statement in the moment expressing discomfort, no recollection of pushing back or setting a boundary at the time. The feeling is described later as shock, but without a clear memory of what was said or done in response. When asked whether the issue was raised with anyone, the answer is yes, but the timing of that conversation can't be recalled. Even whether another person was present during the meeting becomes unclear. The questioning continues, trying to narrow down what exactly was offensive, the discussion of circumcision as a medical choice for a child, or the mention of personal experience. The answer separates the two, stating that the parenting discussion itself wasn't the issue. What was disturbing, according to the testimony, was the personal disclosure. Still, no additional statements, gestures, or follow-up behavior are identified. The entire claim remains anchored to that single exchange. When asked whether this incident affected participation in the project at the time, the response is no. It's characterized as unsettling, but not enough to change course. It's described as something hoped to be isolated, something that didn't immediately raise alarms about safety or intent. That framing matters because it contradicts the idea of a workplace environment becoming unmanageable or hostile from that moment onward. By the end of this portion of the deposition, what stands out most isn't outrage or clarity, it's fragmentation. Answers stretch across pages without resolving the question they're responding to. Simple prompts require multiple follow-ups, and the more opportunities there are to clarify, the more diluted the allegation becomes. Instead of reinforcing the seriousness of the claim, the testimony leaves it feeling undefined, difficult to pin down, and disconnected from the kind of conduct that typically anchors cases like this. By the time the questioning wraps, the bigger picture becomes unavoidable. This never settles into a clear narrative of escalation. There's no pattern being established, no second or third incident that builds on the first. Everything keeps circling back to that one conversation, and even then, the description of harm keeps shifting. What starts as shock becomes discomfort, then disturbance, but never quite solidifies into an actionable event. What makes this stand out even more is what doesn't happen afterward. There's no immediate complaint, no documented attempt to stop the behavior in the moment, no recollection of follow-up conversations that show urgency or fear. Even the timing of when concerns were shared with others is uncertain. For something later framed as deeply serious, the contemporaneous response is surprisingly muted and vague. That disconnect feeds into the larger theory that this was never meant to become a full courtroom fight. The language used throughout the deposition doesn't reflect someone preparing for trial-level scrutiny. Instead, it feels defensive and imprecise, as if the goal was to survive questioning rather than establish facts. When pressed for specifics, the answers don't sharpen, they blur. And in legal settings, blur is dangerous. This is where intent starts to matter. Lawsuits built to win usually over-prepare. They document everything. They lock down timelines. They anticipate the hard questions. What shows up here is the opposite.
Long explanations that avoid the point, repeated inability to recall details that would normally be unforgettable if the experience were as claimed as it was, and a consistent reliance on emotional framing instead of factual grounding. Taken together with the earlier timeline, the rushed filings, the same-day closure, the media coordination, the deposition feels less like the backbone of a case and more like proof that there was never a plan to carry one. The pressure campaign didn't work the way it was supposed to. Instead of forcing apologies or silence, it opened the door to scrutiny, and once scrutiny showed up, the story didn't hold its shape. That's ultimately why this backfired, not because people questioned feelings, but because the structure behind those feelings couldn't support the weight being placed on it. When a claim relies on implication instead of articulation, it collapses under cross-examination. And when the process looks more performative than procedural, it invites doubt instead of support. What remains isn't a clean win for anyone. It's a cautionary example about timing, about credibility, and about how quickly a narrative can unravel when it's built for impact instead of endurance.